let's go ahead and get started here. I think it's the appointed time, and let me welcome our attendees and thank you for joining us today. I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and you have joined us for one of the sessions on the second of the three plenary days of the CNI Spring 2021 virtual meeting. I hope you will join us for an additional event later today and for events tomorrow as we complete this virtual meeting. I also invite you to take advantage of the extensive pre-recorded project briefings that we made available at the beginning of the meeting last week. There's a lot of really good material in there, and I invite you to explore it. This session, like all of the sessions at the spring virtual meeting this year, is being recorded, and it will be publicly available after the meeting concludes. You have a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and please use that and/or the chat box to comment or pose questions at any point during the conversation. The way we're going to do this is Brian Kelly from EDUCAUSE, who is the head of their cybersecurity programs, is going to lead off with a little sort of landscape survey of the evolution of Chief Information Security Officers, or CISOs as they call them, and Chief Privacy Officers, or CPOs. He's going to talk a bit, sort of generally about the landscape. And then we are going to have Kent Wada, who is currently serving as the Chief Privacy Officer at the University of California, Los Angeles, and who I would note is a former CISO as well. And Cheryl Washington, who is currently the CISO at the University of California at Davis. And I want to note also an EDUCAUSE board member. And if I'm correct in my understanding, you are the first CISO to serve as an EDUCAUSE board member, the first active CISO, which is really wonderful. And I should also add, Cheryl is, interestingly, a former Chief Privacy Officer. So in fact, we will get very multidimensional views on this from our participants. After we have some conversation among us for about the last probably 15 minutes or so of the panel, I will take questions from the audience for our panelists. And so please feel free to queue those up at any point. Just to set the stage a little more for this, I want to note that I know we have many people who are involved in library leadership who are with us today. And many of them are probably aware that there are these roles on their campus, but they may not really know a lot about what they do or how they relate to each other and to other activities on campus. And I think that a conversation here is increasingly urgent as libraries deal more and more with getting involved in contracts that deal with individual patron information going to third parties, electronic subscriptions and things. As they get more involved with student success and all of the analytics and data collection that drives a lot of those programs. And indeed, as they just act increasingly as advocates and educators about student and faculty privacy in certain spheres. So I really hope that this session will be sort of a launching point for a very fruitful conversation that will continue. And with that, I think I have said all the opening things I need to say, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Cliff. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting us today and setting up this wonderful talk. I'm honored to be here and be part of this with Kent and Cheryl. As I said before, if I wasn't participating on the panel, I'd certainly be attending to listen to the two of them. So I'm looking forward to that. And that really lends to a little bit about my role at EDUCAUSE in the cybersecurity program and what we're doing around privacy. I often joke about being sort of the collector and the connector of dots, right? And I think in this, it's really, as you said, I think today is the beginning of a conversation, not the end, right? And it opens up sort of that collaborative and awareness, which I think is foundational to what we do at EDUCAUSE. What you're doing at CNI and what we're trying to do here today is to really open up the conversation and talk about how both these roles are evolving, but they're also complementary roles. And Kent and Cheryl, you'll cover that in more detail, but I think that's also important to note today about the complementary nature of that. And I also like to say, and Cheryl and Ken have heard this way too much, is my friend David Sherry at Princeton has really talked about cultural change from the Chief Information Security Office. I say CISO, and I know, Cliff, you said CISO, so it's like tomato, tomato. But what David had said is we're really seeing a shift of becoming the office of KNOW, the office of we want you to know about cybersecurity, about privacy, what we're doing, who's doing it, the things that you mentioned around third parties and applications. And instead of being what was traditionally viewed as the office of NO, right? The office of no, you're doing it insecurely or not doing it correctly. So I think that cultural shift is part of the evolution. And, we're seeing that both in those roles, right? So an evolution in the role of CPO and CISO, but also around the sort of the concept or the ideas and the notion of privacy. And I know, Ken, that's what you all will talk about, but I think that's important to note. And back in November of 2020, it feels like a lifetime ago, EDUCAUSE published a joint research paper that we had produced with Huron, and we were introduced to Huron through Kent and UCLA. And that paper really explored various ways that the data privacy is managed on campus, right? So that's sort of to help inform what we're talking about here today. It also examined sort of the recent legislation around privacy issues that both existed before COVID and some that have arisen through the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we were really trying to do there was uncover some of the challenges, but also figure out paths forward, right? And around how we bring forward not only data privacy, but privacy more generally in higher education. I'll make sure I link that report and get that out in chat so you all have that. And I think that brings us to the CISO and the CPOs are sort of at a crossroads of privacy legislation. And we're, from a compliance and regulatory standpoint and ethics. And that's what we're hearing and seeing most readily from our members is that conversation shifting a little bit. And I think that's important. We had research that we published earlier this year, and it was student focused. It was a student data privacy study, but I think it's applicable when we think about faculty, staff, all of our constituents on campuses. One of the results was really what students want is they want to protect that information regarding not only their personal lives, but their academic and their professional prospects as well. And I think one of the interesting parts of that study I'll pull out is that only 1 in 5 students said they understood how their institutions were using their data, how the institution was using their personal data. And many of them, they didn't trust that their data will be used responsibly, which I think is noteworthy in the context of sort of trust and transparency around privacy. And I think that is informative for our conversation today. So there's plenty of research that EDUCAUSE has. There's plenty of research that that's on your site on CNI. I know, Cliff, you had a paper published toward the end of 2019 that was spot on. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Cliff, or to Ken. I think, Ken, you were up next, but Cliff, I'm not sure if we're going to do questions. So I'll throw it back over and happy to join the conversation.
Thanks so much, Brian, for that introduction. And please do put the link to that paper in the chat because it is a good paper. So I'm going to start with a question to Kent and Cheryl. Um, in asking you to say a bit about how you see your current role as either a CPO or a CISO, and how you see that relating to the other role that you're not currently occupying. Do you want to
Shall I
start?
start?
Or
I'll be
no, go
happy to.
ahead, start, Cheryl.
Um, that is a brilliant question, and I love it. I think it's safe to say that the title of this session speaks volumes to the role of the CISO, in the sense that CISOs have had to grow up over a long period of time to position ourselves in a way where, as Brian pointed out, we are the voice of KNOW as opposed to NO, which is where a lot of people felt they would hear from a CISO whenever asked the question. And if you expect to hear the word no in response to a question, guess what? You stop asking. And what we found was that institutions were creating, a huge volume of risks for itself because we stopped asking questions, which is kind of odd because we're educational institutions, institutions of higher learning, and asking questions is in our DNA. But when it came to security, it became a much tougher job as a CISO to get people to feel comfortable asking the question. And the way we got there was by, as Brian pointed out, translating or transitioning ourselves from NOW to no, KNOW. Let's all figure it out together. And so one of the things that I say when people ask me, well, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a security officer. Well, what does that really mean? It means I help the institution, figure it out. I help the institution enable itself to do what it does best: research, teaching, and learning, and community service. I help, I enable. And so I think, a modern day CISO is part of the institution's culture, in the sense that a modern day CISO is there to help, to enable, to figure it out. It may not be a very clear path as we first look at a problem, but our job is to help to figure it out. As you pointed out, Cliff, in a prior life, I was a CPO. And I think it's very comfortable to say in this seat today that a CPO and a CISO, if they're doing their jobs well, they're going to overlap quite a bit. Our jobs are, for all intents and purposes, is to work together. To, again, and I'm going to sound like a broken record all day long, but to enable the institution to do what it does best. And one of the things that Brian mentioned, I think, really needs to be teased out in any conversation regarding privacy and security, and that is data. Many ways we're talking about data, the protection, collection, management of data, information in many regards. And I think that this particular group, our librarians, you're front and center in the management and collection and processing of data. And in many ways, there's a really great opportunity for a very strong collaboration between privacy, security, and the library and librarians in our libraries, and ensuring that we can move data along on the right path and yet not violate individuals' right to privacy, as well as ensure that we protect that information and it becomes part of our collection. So again, I can talk ad nauseum about this. I'll pass it over to Kent for a moment.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm just thinking about what you said, and privacy is in a little bit of a different space. I'll start by just saying a few years ago, I went to a Thanksgiving dinner and I was invited to. The only person I knew was one of the guests, and she introduced me to the host as UCLA's chief privacy officer. And literally not 60 seconds later, I was introduced by the host to another guest as UCLA's chief security officer. And I think this is still pretty prevalent today. It's not that people don't care or whatever about privacy. It's really they don't understand it still. They understand glimpses of it. And so maybe this session will actually help to a certain extent to clarify. Um, the easy part of privacy, I think, is really what I'd call data protection. You know, it's like just no more breaches. Don't have more breaches of personal data, of social security numbers. Don't let people who shouldn't have, you know, access to my patient data have access to my patient data. That's the easy part. Conceptually, it's really hard to do right, just like security is. I mean, I think security is also in that boat of it's conceptually easy to grasp, really hard to do so that it's effective. Um, but there's another part of privacy, and that's the part that I think most people think about when you bring to mind privacy: security cameras, you know, ubiquitous surveillance, Big Brother, that kind of thing. And of course, Cheryl, just as you spoke, it's often about data. You know, the unbelievable amount of data that is collected about us and that we radiate ourselves just through our cell phones, you know, through our use of browsers, through just our use of the internet. And that part is a little bit more difficult, I think, to grasp, because there is a privacy implication in all of those things, but we also see privacy as you know, in different guises. So when we think about academic freedom, or any of the freedoms, intellectual freedom, you know, freedom to read, freedom to associate, of association, all of those freedoms have an underpinning of privacy somewhere in there. And the advocacy role that I play, you know, sort of the non-data protection piece, you know, is interesting for that reason, because we're going beyond now just protecting data to thinking about the appropriate use and responsible use of data. You know, what should we do? And before I hand this back to Cliff, maybe I'll just say, you know, looking at how you approach these questions of appropriate use, our laws typically will tell us what we can do. No, our laws will tell us what we must do or cannot do. And within those bounds, there's a pretty big discretionary space often, you know, where the institution can figure out for itself what it wants to do. But within what we can't or must do is also the should question. What should we do or what shouldn't we do? You know, and that comes to what Varun was talking about, the ethical, you know, the ethical issues around data, around behavior. But I would actually add a third layer to that, because you know, the ethical issues, the things that I typically see in my job on a day-to-day basis, it's not about, you know, someone wanting to do something wrong and asking, can I do this wrong thing? It's more, I want to do this thing, and there are also good reasons why you shouldn't do this thing. I mean, there are two entirely legitimate reasons you know, that the institution would back both positions equally. And so the decision-making is around a judgment call of, should we do something or shouldn't we do something, when you're comparing an apple and an orange, and both are equally desirable. And, you know, it's that question: how do you make those decisions when you are talking about two legitimate needs that are butting heads, as opposed to, you know, something that's pretty clearly, okay, that's just, no, don't do that. And we can agree on that.
There is so much in there I want to explore. At some point, I want to get back to that advocacy role, Kent, that you spoke of, because I think that's really important. You know, historically, there's been a bit of a sense in which both of these roles have been viewed as kind of, you know, administrative roles, counsel, you know, helping the institution to decide where its risks are and what it should and shouldn't do and can and cannot do, as you say. But really, that advocacy dimension is increasingly important. The other piece that I want to hopefully come back to is some of the you know, to go back to Brian's identification of the ethical space here, the scary ethical contradictions of student success analytics, you know, which perfectly meet Kent's, you know, yet I can come up with two utterly opposed and highly justifiable positions on this. But before I go there, and I do want to go some other places too, I wonder if you all could say a few words about reporting lines, because I know people are very curious about um, both both your actual reporting lines as a CISO or CPO and what's typical at institutions, and also sort of where your dotted line relationships are.
Oh, it's a wonderful question. Traditionally, and particularly in higher education, the CISO reports to the CIO. And a lot of, well, the rationale behind that, I think, is more so legacy than it is perhaps what you might typically find in a private organization or your typical private industries. Um, and again, it's the legacy issue. Security in many ways was sort of brought up or raised in technology. In the early days, our bread and butter, our focus was on just ensuring that the network was safe and well protected. Um, Today, we touched on, one of the areas where most CISOs spend a great deal of their time, and that is managing risk, identification and mediation or remediation of risk. And to that end, you can easily see that security is far past being a technology discipline. It has to integrate with all facets of an organization, particularly one as complex as higher education. Technically speaking, I report to the CIO. Practically speaking, I report to everybody who's at a certain level, to be honest with you. If they call, I answer. If they need something, I respond. It is not uncommon for me to report out to our chancellor, our provost, and others about the state of security across our institution. So I don't think that my life as a CISO here at Davis is theoretically different than many others who are certainly at these large institutions. I think it is quite safe to say that while we don't have formal dotted reporting lines, to do our jobs well and be effective at being CISOs, we have to report to a number of individuals, a number of key stakeholders to ensure that they are aware of what's happening in our institutions. And part of the rationale behind that is at the end of the day, we have a key set of decision makers or individuals who will ultimately be responsible if something were to go terribly wrong. And in this day and age, these individuals want to know that we're on the right path or the wrong path. And if we're on the wrong path, what steps can we do? What can I recommend that we do to begin that self-correction? Kent, I don't know what life is like on the CPO side nowadays, but I would imagine that you too have to report to a number of individuals at times.
Certainly conceptually, that resonates very well, I have to say. I report and have reported to our vice provost for IT for a long time. This is pretty unusual to have privacy reporting through an IT relationship or an IT line. Our vice provost is not our CIO. Interestingly enough, so there's it's a complicated administrative organization. Typically, I think privacy offices these days report through compliance. That's very common. Also, sometimes through the general counsel's office. They may be both privacy attorneys and privacy officers. And then there's a whole raft of other areas where they might land. Records management, in terms of processing Public Records Act requests, part of the administration in any number of places together with policy. I think this is still showing a little bit, where privacy is pretty immature in higher education, because it doesn't, it lands in so many different places. There's no one accepted place. I think it's tending to converge on compliance, though, is probably the closest. And in fact, at UCLA, that is likely where the privacy function is going to move relatively soon. The one thing, though, that I think is actually important to think about, as you say, Cheryl, in many ways, the information security function, the data protection function, and in fact, I like to think of data protection as being sort of the combination of information privacy and information security. And they're very complementary roles in protecting our data including protecting data about people, you have a much larger purview in protecting all data and all infrastructure, computing infrastructure. But we work hand in hand. And so that sort of traditional privacy versus security argument just doesn't really hold there. Where it does, though, start to get into the versus rather than the together is when we think about that advocacy part of privacy, where we're thinking really about the individual. And so this is, I think, a big differentiator on half of the privacy house. And that is, both information security and information privacy is really, as you said, we're thinking about how do we reduce risk to the institution. And as a byproduct, of course, reducing risk to individuals. So don't want to discount that. But the privacy role, on the advocacy half is really about protecting individuals as opposed to protecting the institution. And so it's a combination. Sometimes when you're protecting individuals, you are going counter to what would be best for the institution. And so we get into this odd position of it can be privacy, one type of privacy versus another, rather than privacy versus security.
It's a really strong point, and I completely agree. One of the, I guess, approaches that as UC developed to address that balancing act that we need to perform on both sides, believe it or not. So while Kent is expressing the views as a privacy officer, I completely share his views as a security officer, that there are times when there's a conflict between an individual's rights to privacy and institutions' need to protect itself. When I returned to the University of California, I returned at a time when there was a huge discussion about privacy, and Kent may remember the privacy initiative that he and others spearheaded. One of the beauties of that document was this idea, this concept of a balancing test. We don't always have the answers. The laws may not give us the answers, but I think if we took our time and thought our way through the needs or the rights of individuals versus the needs to continue to protect the institution, we can find a path forward. And this kind of goes back to what we were saying before about the evolution of these roles. Not everything is written down for us. There's not a cookbook that's going to prescribe what you do in any adverse situation. Sometimes you do have to think your way through this. And I think the balancing test, taking this back to the privacy conversation, at least maybe the tension between privacy and security, was designed to force us to think, to sit around the table, to have these discussions and debates about where we might want to land in a way where we are indeed protecting the rights of the individual, which is really important, along with the rights of the institution, which is equally important. Maybe not quite at the same level, but you get my meaning.
And I would just chime in that I think that lends to Cliff a little bit about learning analytics and student success and those type of initiatives, because it's sort of that intersection of the individual privacy, the needs of the institution, and how we balance that from a transparency standpoint. Because at the end, all of those initiatives are based upon data, collecting data, analyzing data, doing something with that. So I think that awareness is really important. And I know our president, John O'Brien, has written and talked a lot in 2020 around that learning analytics and ethics and things along those lines. And I think that's important to him and us. And as you've pointed out, Cliff, I think for your audience, it really is understanding the roles and why we're here today, right? The roles of both that individual privacy and the institutional value you get from that data.
And I just note that EDUCAUSE has done some very thoughtful presentations on particularly the ethics around student analytics. I've seen several over the past year or two that have been really good. Let me go in a slightly different direction, but one that actually connects up with some of the things that both Cheryl and Kent were saying. Last week, as part of our spring meeting, I convened 3 roundtables, each with different institutions, to look at post-COVID strategies, strategies that are informing people's planning for the 21-22 academic year and beyond. And one of the things that was tagged there was that there has been, and it looks like there will continue to be, a substantial investment in technology broadly to support public health and wellness. And that has some very unusual aspects to it. For example, in some cases, universities are sharing data with county health departments and things of that nature. There was also many of those systems were frankly, let's be honest, rushed out in the past year in the face of terrific and urgent need. Sometimes without all of the considerations that might have been given in more normal times. One of the observations that I heard was that in some sense, all of the stuff that's been done for the pandemic and that may stay in place to help manage, the tail end of the pandemic and all of the issues about bringing students back, helping them to succeed, student wellness and mental health and all of those concerns that are very much on the minds of university presidents. There was a concern that these may have normalized a bunch of privacy compromises that maybe we really want to be careful about normalizing and may want to try and walk back a bit. And I'm wondering if you have any reactions or thoughts on that complex of observations.
Kit, would you like to start?
Sure. So I look at this actually as it's very similar to what happened after 9/11 with the USA Patriot Act, which modified, tremendous amounts of legislation, much of which impacted privacy. And I think also, as a byproduct, galvanized the library community, in fact, to become very active in terms of thinking about privacy. It's certainly true, so much of what we do on an emergency basis, of course, we have to do things, whether it's a national security imperative or a public health imperative. They're just things we have to do. But if we're not careful to put sunset clauses or review clauses in things, then it is, as you say, very easily, just something you continue to do because it's convenient, it doesn't take more work, and in fact could be actually really helpful in other situations. I like to think, about data. One of the lessons is, once you collect any kind of data, someone at some point is going to think of another use, another bright idea for how to use that data. And it's not that we shouldn't reuse that data, but there are all sorts of considerations, when you have secondary and tertiary and so on uses of data that you've already collected for a purpose, and now you're repurposing it. Yes, I think that's one of the foundational concerns that privacy people have. That we normalize things and in fact we socialize them, inadvertently sometimes, before we even had a chance, for example, to think about what it meant to socialize and normalize facial recognition. On the one hand, people are very concerned. On the other, they have no problems just putting their phones in front of their face and unlocking it without thinking about what implications that really has, and however many tens of millions of people do that around the world every day, several times a day.
And Kent mentioned a couple of things that I really want to emphasize. It is absolutely true that many of us had to rush to get new technologies, new processes, basically a whole new world in place in a very short period of time in response to the pandemic. But having gone through not quite the same experience, but maybe comparable experiences taught us some lessons from those prior experiences. And one key lesson, again, something that Kent mentioned, was to insert clauses or milestones or moments where you take a step back, you breathe, you ask maybe a slightly different set of questions, and perhaps adjust accordingly. So, normalization is one thing, but etching something in stone where it can't be changed is something else. And I think many of us knew that we were working fast and furious, and that at some point when I can't say sense of urgency died down because it hasn't died down, but when we got a moment to breathe, we would take a step back, look at what we've done, and make the necessary corrections to sort of right size our environment. Having said that, the pandemic has opened up a slightly different world for us. Many of our institutions now use the term work from home as part of our DNA. And it has created, at least for me, both opportunity as well as challenge to figure out how do I extend the reach of the university security profile into areas where it may not feel so comfortable, like the home. If we have as many people working from home in the near future as we have today, then the home becomes, in some degree, and we can debate what that degree value is, it becomes an extension of the university. We have workstations, we have data, we have people who are in their homes doing what they would normally do here on-prem. So we have challenges in front of us. I'm even, I'm not even close to saying that life is normal yet. Even though we've created a slightly different journey for ourselves, I think we still have quite a bit of work ahead of ourselves in ensuring that that new journey for us is as secure as the old journey was.
I'll just add from a privacy viewpoint that remote working is also definitely affecting the privacy side, as you sort of alluded to. There are privacy implications of people who are not in a space where they can show their background, or prefer not to show their background, or literally have to share their space with others, even as they're talking or presenting or taking tests. All sorts of equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, around the work from home model.
Thanks. That really is a wonderfully helpful perspective from both of you on this whole situation we're facing, and thoughts on how to move past it, and think about sunsetting things. I want to turn to two final areas before I open this up to questions from the audience. And this is a pair of developments that I've been watching, and I know my colleagues in the library have been watching with growing unease. One is the development of electronic textbooks, electronic interactive learning platforms, things of that nature, from commercial companies, where those tools, it's very easy for a faculty member to say, well, I'm assigning this as the textbook. Yet the student, in order to use that textbook, has to buy into a lot of very invasive transmission of his or her interactions back to a commercial provider that will do heaven knows what with it subsequently. And that's been a very hard transition, because they used to just be books, and faculty absolutely defended their right to select the textbook they thought was appropriate and assign it. That's been a very nasty transition to navigate and get some policy and ethical handles on. And then there's a kind of a parallel situation that libraries run into, where as key journals have made the transition from print to electronic, all of a sudden the ability to ensure that their patrons are not being tracked and that information isn't being reused and resold is much harder to deal with, and really largely has to be handled contractually ultimately, as part of those license agreements. And that's been another one that's been challenging for libraries to step up to. You don't always find, sort of the kind of language you'd like in those license agreements. And so I'm very concerned with both of those scenarios, and I'd like your take on these from the privacy and security point of view, as well as perhaps your thoughts for how you could work with libraries, faculty, instructional technologists, and others to get a handle on some of these challenges.
I don't mind starting. This particular world that you described is perhaps for me today the number one challenge. I'll be frank. As more and more of our institutions engage with third parties, it used to be, all we had to do was sign a contract, and we all go our merry way. Today, I would suggest to all of us that that's the easy step. Now we have to manage the relationship between institution and vendor, or institution and third party, for all the reasons that you described. And that is, as our suppliers grow in their capabilities and their desire to collect more and more information about us, we have to be on our toes and do all that we can to remain aware of what they're asking of our students or of our faculty or of ourselves. Each time we click on a web page or sign up for a new expanded service that sounds beautiful on the surface, but underneath the surface, to your point, you've now given away your mortgage. I'm being facetious here, but you get the point. And part of what I have done in response to that challenge is, in our security program, we have a vendor management program. And I've got a team of individuals who spend a great deal of their time working with many of our stakeholders, our libraries and other parties on campus, to engage vendors from start to the end of our engagement with them. So from start to finish. We spend a lot of time going through their security posture, trying to understand what they can do with our data once it's in their hands. But that's not the end of the story. Many of these companies grow over time, and their services grow over time, their capabilities grow over time, and their wants for our data grows over time. And so our vendor management program has to remain in touch with these vendors through the course of the engagement with them. So it's not a one and done once you sign your contract. It is an engagement. And I think that our program is not alone. I think many institutions, and Brian maybe can speak to this, knowing some of the other universities across the country, many of them are grappling with the same challenge of how do we maintain our supplier relationships so that things don't get out of hand, that we're not inadvertently sending them more information than perhaps our original intent was. So you're hitting on, from my perspective, a substantial challenge for higher education. Now, having said that there's a challenge there, I'll see light at the end of the tunnel. And that is, we're a community that often shares information, and we're quick to do so. When we find a bad actor, and I mean that in the right way, that a vendor who's maybe not working according to plan, we have no qualms about sharing that information with our peers. And between all of us, we often, if we do our jobs well, can put pressure on vendors to self-correct before things get totally out of hand. But the word that comes to mind when you were describing the scenario was vigilance. We have to maintain vigilance when we're dealing with a lot of these third parties. I'll stop there. Brian, Kent, what do you guys think?
And I would echo Cheryl. I think what we're hearing and seeing at EDUCAUSE, and I mean, we're looking at creating sort of a vendor risk management program to help sort of with the extension of the HECVAT, provide a resource that institutions can look at. And I know Kent may talk about this as he co-chairs our CPO group, the sort of, the questions that you're managing right now with regard to security and third parties and vendors. We're working with the CPO group and the HECVAC group to figure out if there's a way to start integrating privacy questions, right? Is there an equivalency of asking those third parties the privacy questions? And I'll let Kent speak to that. Maybe that's off topic for you, but I think that's important because it all ties back to that awareness that we started with, right? Is raising awareness of the stakeholders of the institution to be asking those questions and have that tempo to manage that. So I think you're on the right track. Kent. Kent, we can't hear you.
Completely agree. I have to say, I wish I had a team like yours, Cheryl. I wish I had a team, period.
It's just not big enough, but they're working hard.
So completely agree in every way. The whole supplier management, vendor management issue is so forefront today, particularly in terms of the data. But I'll add one other piece, and that's the fact that exactly the kinds of practices and uses of data that we decry in our third-party partners, we often do ourselves within our own institution in terms of use for predictive analytics, in terms of student success initiatives. We use all the same data because we feel it's ours. And I think it's in fact a more complicated question because over the last several years, I think we've proven that student data is a valuable asset. That's why there's such a big fight over who controls it, who owns it. But independent of the ownership issue, we can identify at least 3 sort of cohorts who have vested interest, and certainly the supplier, the third party, our own institutions, and the students themselves. They're the subject matter. They're the creators of the data in some sense, or at least the data is created about them. And surely they have a vested interest in how their own data is being used. So I think it is a more complicated question because internally we use this data for all sorts of reasons that students may or may not agree with. They may or may not agree that they want to have a student success initiative applied to them if it appears coercive, for example. Or if you can't prove to them that the algorithms that are being used to make predictions are not biased or not extending bias that we already have. So just adding layers of complexity here to this whole issue of how we use data appropriately, and that applies to us as well.
Fascinating. That's really, that again, you've put a whole added dimension on this that is very helpful. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I think we better open it up to the attendees here and allow them to raise a few questions. Please put it in chat, put it in the Q&A box, or if you want to ask a question by voice, I can make that happen as well. And here we have our first question. Thanks for an excellent talk. Here at Lehigh, we have a merged organization, libraries reporting to the same VP as the CTO and CISO, a useful, an interesting and fruitful structure. But still, I often think what folks like you think about us. Is this kind of merged organization a good idea? If cybersecurity is going to be a sort of a growth area, a more central area for higher education, is this going to start constraining resources that libraries can select? How do we scale up to handle this kind of set of demands and threats? Are there national structures that are liable to be helpful here? So that's actually a lot of questions.
I
Jump
don't,
in.
I'm
I'm sorry,
teasing
go ahead,
that.
Cheryl.
Well, I'm just going to say openly, I don't know of any other organization that's configured in the manner described, but I'll say on a personal level, I work very closely with our chief librarian. And in fact, she's done a remarkable job of helping the institution begin to think about another concept, and that is data management. And through her work, we have privacy, security, librarians, and others talking to one another about our arenas. And I think the conversation is wonderful. Uh, it doesn't really address the reporting line question, but I'm just sort of teasing out the reporting line question and asking myself, is the conversation worth having? And the answer is absolutely yes. Even before coming to Davis, in the early stages of my career as a CISO, I spent a lot of time with our librarians and learned quite a bit about their area, which actually, when you think about it, there's clear differences, but there's some parallels in what our librarians were trying to achieve and what I was trying to achieve as CISO. And in fact, that relationship or those relationships worked out equally beautifully because I could see and highly respect the work that the librarians had to do in order to continue to keep an environment that was open, yet well managed, put it that way. I don't want to use the word control. I want to use the word managed. So if I could tease out from that question, is it good for these three individuals to converse? The answer is absolutely yes. Whether or not they're reporting to the same person or in the same group, I'm not sure if that matters as much to me as whether or not that conversation is taking place at all. And it sounds like it is, so I think it's a good thing.
Brian, Kent, you want to comment on that?
No, I was trying to read through that question as well. I think, obviously the information security report was sort of in some areas one version of a potential future, right? It's not a predictive, it's a report that highlights potential futures. So I think that growth scenario was really around, to some degree, just the importance of both, and it wasn't focused on privacy, it was more information security, although they weren't sort of uniquely separated. It does show sort of, I think there was a question about national infrastructure. We at EDUCAUSE are always working with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Administration, CISA, and the FBI and others to try to make sure that higher ed is included in those conversations. Whether higher ed will be designated a critical infrastructure anytime soon that would give us some national protection, that's probably another webinar for another day. So I'll sort of leave it at that.
Yeah, and there are certainly a number of key national structures like Red and ISAC and things of that nature. Do you want to comment, Kent?
No, I think Cheryl and Brian have covered it all.
Okay, let me move on to the next question, and it's a more pointed and in some ways easier one. How concerned should universities be about foreign government cyber threats, and what threat vectors are most concerning?
Oh, I have to sit back and take a deep breath and say, I am on a personal level very concerned as the CISO for UC Davis, very concerned, and emphasize the word very, largely because of the scope of our presence across the globe. Most of these institutions, ourselves included, we have a global presence. While we are physically here in the state of California, we're literally all over the world. And it just makes for a path into our environment in ways that many of us cannot begin to imagine. We are seeing, and Brian probably could speak to this as well, that across the nation, there are some global tensions that are manifesting themselves in cyberspace. And universities are not immune to being caught in the middle of some of these conflicts. And I'm trying to be as delicate as I can be. But the short answer to the question is we should be concerned. The response to that concern would be we should be aware and we should have practices in place to accept the fact that we're in a new world, a different reality. It doesn't mean we stop doing what we do. Doesn't mean we stop living, stop opening up our libraries to even foreign patrons. It just simply means that it's a slightly different dynamic that we have to contend with. And believe it or not, we are. So concern, yes, but we're working on it. Brian, your thought?
I would echo everything you said, Cheryl. I think that, I was on a call yesterday with the Federal Student Aid Administration, and I said, very much what you just said. The higher ed is working on it. We are doing things. I think we'll continue, EDUCAUSE will continue to do that. I think awareness, I keep coming back to awareness, right? And our role at EDUCAUSE and on each campus is to raise the awareness of those threats, to make our constituents aware of that and what remedies they can take. So, being recorded and, being careful around the threats, I think I echo everything, Cheryl, that you've put forward.
Yeah, I didn't answer the second question, the threat vectors that are most concerning. There isn't a one, let's put it that way. As a CISO, I have to look at the broader picture. Any way into our institution, no matter where the institution may physically be, is a threat vector for me, and it will concern me. So if we have someone in Timbuktu, I am as concerned about their welfare and their security capabilities as I am as concerned about someone here on-prem.
And I would just add, we often hear about these advanced nation state attacks. Oftentimes the threat vector still remains email.
Exactly.
A simple email starts that chain in process. So that still remains a viable threat vector.
Here's one that I think is quite interesting, and I'd love to hear Kent and Cheryl's view on this. Your thoughts on the skills that you wish principal investigators and researchers would focus on in areas relevant to your work?
Kit, would you like to start?
Sure. It's true. I think when we're talking about how you give training and awareness, or even awareness, to the researcher community, you do have to take a different approach than the rest of, say, the institution. And in fact, I'm just going to put in here a link to, oh, I hope I didn't close that question accidentally, to a program, it's called Trusted CI. It's an NSF Cyber Center of Excellence. And they do spend, a lot of their focus is in fact on how do you do security, I think, effectively within an academic environment and a research environment. And this particular link I sent is about the Trusted CI Fellows program, where they're, taking people of all backgrounds and giving, elevating them in terms of their security knowledge so they can become ambassadors really back to their own research communities. I think a really interesting and well, personally, I have a vested interest because I got to speak to them at one point about privacy, since this is mainly about security. But I think a really interesting program, and I'm sorry it's only it's such a small cadre every year that they can accept.
Yeah, I should just mention that Trusted CI program broadly is really very good and has put on a number of wonderful webinars that are open to anybody who's interested. And I would urge you to have a look at them if you're not familiar with their offerings. Cheryl.
And I would add, I spend a lot of time with our research community, and will likely end up doing more so in the near future. I think we touched on regulatory compliance obligations early on in our talk, and I'm beginning to see, and I think some of our PIs are beginning to see, that this new swath of regulations is hitting them pretty hard and fast and furious. And in many, many ways, I really appreciate the question, because it would be the first question I would ask is, now, how do I get started? How do I get my arms around all of this? And I think for me, I would probably approach this in multiple dimensions. One is, to Kent's point, there are some pretty good resources out there. I too would echo the earlier comments about Trusted CI. I've worked with that group as well, and I think some of their materials are fabulous and just readily available online. The other thing I would do is to engage in the conversations with your CISO or your CPO, and just talk about what you're doing from a research perspective, or what you'd like to do with your research. And let's, again, as I said early on, figure out a path forward before we find ourselves in a sort of emergency crisis situation, trying to answer questions that perhaps we could have anticipated. And then lastly, I would suggest is not try to solve this problem yourself. I can fully appreciate the work of many of our researchers, our PIs, even our postdocs and others. It's a heavy lift to do something so incredibly new and different. Perhaps the last thing you want to think about is security and privacy and controls and risk and all the stuff that I do. Perhaps maybe an easier approach would be, let's have a conversation and allow me and my staff and staffs that I can pull together, help you figure out how best to protect and secure your infrastructure. To say it a little bit differently, a conversation and a collaboration might be the first step I'd take, as opposed to trying to figure out all the answers to these questions by yourself.
Well, we are a little past time. Let me just thank you all for a wonderful panel. This has been very informative, and I think our attendees have learned a lot here. I hope, as I said at the outset, that this can be the start of a conversation, and I would welcome any or all of you back in future to continue aspects of it. I'd also welcome and be happy to facilitate any outreach that you would like to do to the CNI community to gain more information or insight or thoughts on developments as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to declare the session finished with my heartfelt thanks to all three of you. It has been such a pleasure to be able to do this with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a delight.